Landlords, have you ever found yourself in a position where you're completely confused about the people who are currently living on your property? You might actually be the victim of a tenant swap. The people who you thought were going to live on your property aren't actually there. What do you do in that situation? Talking all about that tenant swap. Let's get started. First, let's make sure we're talking about the right thing. What is an unauthorized tenant? Well, essentially an unauthorized tenant is someone who is on your rental property without your authorization. And the clearest way to be able to identify who is authorized is to look at your lease. If your lease does not allow the tenant to simply bring in other people, then any other people who are there without your express written permission are unauthorized. Does your lease discuss the fact that you are allowed as the landlord to evict on the basis of an unauthorized tenant? Does your lease mention who is permitted to be on the property? And what happens if people are on the property who are not otherwise permitted? You need to get familiar enough with your lease to know whether or not these restrictions exist. And if they do exist, what you as a landlord can do about it in terms of delivering notice and eventually, again, if those unauthorized tenants persist, eventually filing for an eviction. Now, why is this a bad thing in the first place? Well, think about the screening process that you went through to find the tenant who is currently occupying the space. If the people who are there would never have made it through the screening process, then the problem that you are avoiding by getting rid of them are the same problems you would have avoided by never allowing them onto the property. For example, if you have someone who's been previously evicted numerous times, you would never welcome them onto your property as a tenant because of the high likelihood that they will have to be evicted from your property. By allowing someone like this to remain on your property, you subject yourself to future risk of rent losses. Even if the rent is presently on time, has presently been paid, you run that risk if someone who is there has a record of non-payment. If you have someone who's living there under some false ID, then nothing you do in the courts is actually going to have a legitimate effect on them. So at a certain point, any damage, for example, that they cause to the property is uncollectible from the named party if the party who is residing there isn't even a party to your lease. You would have virtually no access to hold the actual person who did the actual harm accountable to you, and therefore leaving you powerless to do anything about the harm that they cause. Because of this, it's important to get ahead of the whole thing and simply remove them from your property because they were never allowed to be there in the first place. Now, how is it that you can be certain you know the people who are going to be on the property and the people who are allowed to be there? Again, it's always in your lease. But you may be asking yourself, look, I had one person sign the lease. What should I have done in order to be certain that the people who are there are only the people who are allowed to be there? Couple of tips. Number one, if you know you're going to have 3 adults in the rental property, it's important that all 3 adults sign that lease. Don't just leave it to the one chief adult, even if it's just one person actually paying. Have all the adults sign the lease, and so that they're all bound for its repercussions. Well, let's say things are a little bit different. Let's say there's a mix of adults and children. Definitely have all the adults sign the lease and have all of the children identified as occupants. Your lease should have a section that identifies who is occupying the space. This is left for people who otherwise are not eligible to sign the lease. And it should not include adults, maybe the elderly, maybe the disabled, but it should definitely include all of the children. And so in this section, you can identify minors by name. A first name is sufficient, but you can identify the minor by name and in parentheses their age. So that it's very clear that you have 2 adults in this example who signed the lease and maybe two two children who are occupying the property. In this way, you know that 4 people are there, 2 adults and 2 children. So that if you later visit the property and the situation is different, you've got 3 adults and 6 children, you know something went wrong. Some unauthorized occupants are now on the premises and you have to do something about it. If you found today's video helpful, I ask that you give us a like. If you've got a question or a comment, please add that below. And if you're not yet a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Now, sometimes when a landlord is the victim of a tenant swap, it's because the person that they dealt with before the occupancy turns out to be a different person than actually occupies the property. And this happens sometimes when everything is done remotely. So for example, all the application process is done and at no time does anyone actually see who the occupant will ultimately be. And maybe an ID is supplied, but maybe it's not an authentic ID. So what I tend to recommend to landlords is that you have a face-to-face meeting whenever possible before a lease is signed, before keys are ever handed over, before a single dollar is ever accepted, and certainly before that occupancy occurs. You have a face-to-face with the person who plans to occupy the property. Definitely, if you could see all of the adults who are signing the lease, that is key. So that at the very least, you understand who signed everything and who is now occupying. If it turns out to be a completely different set of people, you likely have unauthorized occupants on the premises. Additionally, when you only get things through email, it's very easy to fabricate documents, including identification. You also want to see a physical ID. If all you've ever seen is a digital copy, that's the highest likelihood that you are looking at a fabrication. Make sure that before you sign, before you hand over keys, and before somebody occupies your property, that you've seen a physical copy of that state-issued ID. Finally, in the event of a tenant swap, who are you allowed to sue? Let's say you know that Joe Smith signed the lease, but John Brown is living on the property. Do you sue Joe or do you sue John? If your contract is with Joe, then it's said in the law you do not have a contractual obligation either to or from John, and so you're left only with Joe. And you say, well, I don't know who Joe is. I've never actually seen Joe. John has been the only one who's ever occupied this unit. Still, the law requires that you sue Joe because technically Joe signed the lease. And this happens sometimes when someone with better credit or better rental history or longer work history is a better applicant and they sign on behalf of someone else. Well, it's not always a good idea because in situations like this, when you have to sue someone, you're going to want to sue the person who actually signed the lease. They're truly the only ones obligated to you under the terms of your written agreement. And so when you sue the one who signed, which is why it's important when you've got multiple adults who plan to occupy space that each of those adults sign your lease, so that if it ever comes down to who owes the money, well, all 3 of them are equally obligated. Even if they're splitting the rent between them, you know, your lease should properly identify that all 3 of them owe the 100% of the lease, whether it's one person paying, all 3 of them paying, and the amount that they pay between them doesn't matter so long as you receive 100% of the rent. Just the same, all 3 of them are equally liable to you for maintenance of the property's condition, and ultimately the full term of that lease. Make sure that you are well aware of who is signing, and if it comes to a lawsuit, you are suing the person who actually signed your lease. That's the best way that you can collect, and the truest way that you'll be able to prove what your agreement was. The person who signed is the person you sue. I hope you found today's video helpful, and as you know, there's a ton of videos on this channel. I encourage you to watch them all. Until next time, I wish you the best, but if you are interested in watching more, YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next best thing for you to watch. I encourage you to watch it and any of the other content we have here. Until next time, happy leasing.